the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their significance. What if everything you thought you knew about the origins of the New Testament was about to change? Imagine holding in your hands fragments of ancient manuscripts, untouched for nearly 2,000 years, that could completely rewrite the early history of Christianity. These are not just dusty old scrolls, but potential keys to secrets that have been buried for centuries. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 in the desolate Qumran caves near the Dead Sea, have long been hailed as one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. But recent research suggests they might be hiding something even more extraordinary, something that could challenge the very foundations of Christian belief. Picture this: a young shepherd, casually exploring the rugged hills near the Dead Sea, tosses a stone into a cave, only to hear the unexpected sound of breaking pottery. What he discovers next is a treasure trove of ancient manuscripts, over 900 of them, meticulously hidden away by a mysterious Jewish sect living around the time of Jesus. These texts, dating back to the Second Temple period, provide a window into the lives, beliefs, and apocalyptic expectations of a Jewish community isolated from the rest of society. But what if I told you that hidden within these ancient Jewish writings are fragments that could predate the very Gospels they hint at? For decades, scholars have studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, poring over their brittle parchment and deciphering their ancient Hebrew and Aramaic texts. Most of what they found were exactly what they expected: biblical manuscripts of the Old Testament, commentary on Jewish law, and sectarian rules that governed the lives of the Qumran community. However, a whisper began to emerge among a small group of scholars. What if there were more to these scrolls than meets the eye? What if, hidden among these texts, there were fragments of early Christian writings that have been lost to history? What if these caves held within them the earliest seeds of the New Testament? Enter Professor José O'Callaghan, a daring Spanish scholar who risked his reputation to pursue an unthinkable theory. O'Callaghan meticulously examined tiny fragments of papyrus and parchment, some barely bigger than a postage stamp, and noticed something extraordinary. He proposed that some of these fragments bore an uncanny resemblance to passages from the New Testament, specifically the Gospels of Mark and letters like 1 Timothy. Could it be that these texts, long thought to have been written well after the death of Jesus, were already circulating among early Jewish and Christian communities decades before anyone realized? If O'Callaghan's claims are correct, it would mean that parts of the New Testament were not only written but considered sacred enough to be hidden away in the same caves that held the most revered Jewish scriptures. This could mean that the Gospels and epistles were being read, copied, and preserved long before the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, a revelation that would rewrite the timeline of early Christianity. But why hasn't the world fully accepted this potentially groundbreaking discovery? The answer lies in the tiny size and fragmentary nature of these pieces, mere shreds of ancient papyrus that leave much room for debate and doubt. Skeptics argue that these fragments could easily be from other, now-lost texts. Yet, O'Callaghan's meticulous research comparing letter sequences and spacing to known ancient writings has produced matches that are too precise to ignore. His work has ignited a fiery debate that continues to this day, with supporters and critics clashing over the authenticity and implications of these findings. Imagine the impact if these fragments were indeed the earliest traces of the New Testament. It would suggest a timeline where the Gospels and other Christian writings were created, circulated, and revered much earlier than traditionally believed. It would challenge the idea that Christianity was a separate movement, showing instead a closer, more intertwined relationship with its Jewish roots than previously imagined. The Dead Sea Scrolls have always been more than just relics of the past. They are keys to understanding a world on the brink of transformation. And now, they might hold the power to unlock a new chapter in the story of faith, a chapter that could forever change our understanding of the origins of Christianity. The controversial claim of New Testament fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What if the most controversial discovery in biblical archaeology was hiding in plain sight? In the dusty, dimly lit rooms of academia, a storm has been brewing, one that could shake the very foundations of what we believe about the New Testament. It revolves around a radical idea put forward by a bold scholar, Professor Jose O'Callaghan, who dared to suggest that among the ancient fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls are pieces of the New Testament itself. His claim is nothing short of revolutionary, suggesting that these Christian writings could date back to a time much earlier than previously thought, existing alongside the Jewish texts cherished by the Qumran community. Let's dive into the heart of this controversy. O'Callaghan's theory centers on several small fragments of parchment labeled 7Q5, 7Q4, 7Q8, and Q, each discovered in Cave 7 of Qumran. These fragments are tiny, mere scraps of ancient paper, but they have set the academic world ablaze. Fragment 7Q5 in particular features partial Greek words that closely align with a passage from the Gospel of Mark, Mark 6:52-53. To the untrained eye, these tiny scraps might look like any other ancient manuscript, but to O'Callaghan, they held the potential to rewrite history. He painstakingly compared the visible Greek letters on the fragments to all known biblical and non-biblical texts from the period. His meticulous analysis suggested that the sequence of letters matched only one known text, the Gospel of Mark. Could it be that this tiny scrap is a piece of one of the earliest copies of the New Testament, predating the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD? O'Callaghan thought so, and his assertion sent ripples through the scholarly community. But this was just the beginning. Another fragment, 7Q4, contains phrases that seem to echo 1 Timothy 3:16, "He appeared in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by angels, was preached among the nations, was believed on in the world, was taken up in glory." And yet another, Q, might correspond with passages from Romans 10:8-9, while Q could be from Mark 4:28. Each of these potential connections deepens the mystery and fuels the debate. If these fragments indeed belong to the New Testament, it would suggest that early Christian texts were circulating and even being revered among Jewish communities far earlier than we ever imagined. O'Callaghan's methods were rigorous. He focused on matching not only the visible letters, but also the spacing and context, comparing these with a vast array of ancient writings. His conclusion? The sequences of letters aligned perfectly with these New Testament passages, and no other known texts from the period contain these exact combinations. But not everyone agrees. Critics argue that the fragments are simply too small and incomplete to make definitive identifications. They suggest that other undiscovered texts could also share these sequences, and thus the fragments might not be from the New Testament at all. Despite the criticisms, O'Callaghan's findings have sparked an ongoing debate and further research into the presence of early Christian texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Could it be that the early Christian communities were much more intertwined with Jewish groups than we previously believed? What if these tiny fragments are indeed pieces of the earliest New Testament writings? The questions remain unanswered, but the implications are profound. The implications of potential New Testament fragments on Christian history and faith. What if the roots of the New Testament run deeper into the Jewish world than we ever thought possible? If the Dead Sea Scrolls indeed contain fragments of the New Testament, it would challenge our entire understanding of early Christianity. The implications are staggering. These writings could have been circulating much earlier than traditionally believed, potentially during the lifetimes of Jesus' closest followers. Imagine the impact of discovering that the Gospel of Mark, often considered the earliest gospel, was written and distributed within just a few decades of Jesus' death. This would mean that these texts were being read and revered alongside Jewish scriptures before the cataclysmic events of 70 AD, when Jerusalem and Qumran were destroyed by the Romans. If true, it would suggest that early Christians and Jews might not have been as separated as we think. Instead, they may have shared more in common, coexisting and exchanging ideas, scriptures, and even prophecies in a complex and turbulent religious landscape. But why is this timeline so crucial? because it places the New Testament writings within a period where eyewitnesses to Jesus' life and ministry were still alive. This proximity to the events themselves would add weight to the authenticity and historical reliability of the Gospels and epistles. These texts wouldn't just be stories written down long after the fact, they would be living documents reflecting the beliefs and memories of those who were there. Furthermore, the presence of these fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls suggests that early Christian communities were more widespread and organized than previously thought. They were preserving their texts with the same care and devotion as the Jewish community at Qumran preserved theirs. This convergence of sacred texts could point to a time when Christian writings were still emerging from their Jewish roots, highlighting the fluidity of religious identity in the first century. The discovery would also cast a new light on the prophetic texts within the Gospels. If these texts were indeed written and circulating before the fall of Jerusalem, it lends a powerful credibility to the prophecies attributed to Jesus, such as his foretelling of the temple's destruction in Luke 21:20-24. This would not just be a matter of faith, but of historical record, showing that these prophecies were recorded before their fulfillment. The convergence of history and prophecy in this way would strengthen the argument for the early dating of these texts and suggest a more profound relationship between Jewish and Christian communities during this time. The debate and criticism surrounding the identification of New Testament fragments. What if one discovery could spark a never-ending debate that challenges our understanding of religious history? That's precisely what's happening with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the controversial claims of New Testament fragments. Professor Jose O'Callaghan's findings have ignited a heated debate that refuses to die down. On one side are those who see his work as a breakthrough that could redefine our understanding of early Christianity. On the other are skeptics who believe the evidence is far too flimsy to make such bold claims. Critics argue that the fragments are simply too small, with only a few letters visible on each piece. How could anyone be sure they belong to the New Testament? Some scholars suggest that these fragments could easily have come from other, now lost texts from the same period. They argue that without more substantial evidence, identifying these fragments as New Testament writings is speculative at best. Yet, supporters of O'Callaghan's theory argue that the precision of his comparisons cannot be so easily dismissed. The fact that these fragments match so closely with known New Testament texts and only with these texts is a significant point in favor of his claims. They argue that such precise matches are unlikely to be coincidental, given the vast array of ancient literature available for comparison. This ongoing debate reveals the complexity and difficulty of working with fragmentary evidence from the ancient world. It's a reminder that even the tiniest pieces of history can provoke big questions and spark intense discussions. As new technologies emerge and more discoveries are made, the debate is sure to evolve. But for now, the question remains. Are these fragments truly pieces of the New Testament, or are they simply a tantalizing mirage, sparking hope and controversy in equal measure? Chronological and prophetic significance of the findings. What if the Dead Sea Scrolls are not just historical artifacts, but prophetic markers? If these fragments are indeed pieces of the New Testament, they would hold significant chronological and prophetic weight. The idea that these texts were circulating before the destruction of Jerusalem implies that early Christians had a keen awareness of the prophecies attributed to Jesus, particularly those concerning the fall of the city. This discovery could be seen as a powerful validation of the prophetic nature of the New Testament. Imagine a timeline where the Gospels and epistles are not only written down but actively shared and cherished among believers as the Roman world teeters on the brink of chaos. If these writings were indeed recognized and preserved by early Christian communities before 70 AD, it places the composition of these New Testament books firmly within the lifetimes of the apostles and contemporaries of Jesus. Such a revelation would be monumental. It would mean that the very predictions about Jerusalem's destruction and the coming persecution of believers were recorded not after the fact, before, adding a level of authenticity to these prophetic statements that is hard to ignore. The Dead Sea Scrolls would then serve not only as historical documents, but as testimonies to the early spread of Christian texts and ideas, bridging the gap between Jewish traditions and the emerging Christian faith. Re-evaluating our understanding of early Christian texts, could one discovery change the way we see the foundations of faith? The potential identification of New Testament fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls challenges everything we know about the early Christian era. It suggests a timeline where these texts were not only written earlier but were widely disseminated and valued by communities deeply connected to Jewish traditions. This revelation blurs the lines between these two great faiths, highlighting a shared history that has often been overlooked. For believers, historians, and seekers alike, the Dead Sea Scrolls continue to be a source of fascination and mystery. They remind us that our understanding of history is always evolving, shaped by the discoveries we make and the questions we dare to ask. What other secrets might these ancient scrolls be hiding? Could they hold even more clues about the origins of the texts that have shaped Western civilization for centuries? The journey to uncover the truth continues, and one thing is certain: the Dead Sea Scrolls still have many stories to tell.